Well, hello and welcome to the pre-work for your mentor development programme, which I'll be running with you at the Richmond and Wandsworth Borough Councils. You're hearing from me, Michelle Lucas, your course director. In this short recording, I'll be walking you through the 6 C's of a mentoring conversation. I'll talk you through the structure of the model and also be offering you some questions that you might find useful as the conversation flows. It's helpful to have a look at this in advance of the workshop so that you are in a really strong place to work with it when we actually meet. So let's take a look at why we chose the 6 C's as a model. Well, it was developed by Mike Pegg back in the late 1990s, specifically with mentoring in mind. And each of the C's reflects what I think is the complexity of real-life mentoring. Additionally, what I found particularly helpful was the model signposts to you, the mentor, where you can best offer your experience. And it may be interesting to think about that isn't always early on in the relationship or early on in the conversation. It can sometimes serve both you and your mentee to hold on to your experience for a little while. I think the model is also simple and effective, and in time you can definitely craft it to your own style. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about the model, then he has a book which places the model in context. I found it very accessible and it's still available on Amazon. So let's take a look at the 6 C's of the model. As you can see here in this diagram, it starts at the top with C for contracting. We then move on to challenges, identify the choices that we have, think through the consequences of those choices. We then look at creative solutions before moving to conclusions. What's interesting as presented, it looks like it's a kind of linear model, but in reality it can bounce about a bit. You can use these 6 C's as a guide for a single session. You could also use it as a guide for the entire mentoring relationship. So for example, you could have 6 sessions, one focusing on each of the C's. But in my own experience, I find that whilst you might have this as a useful guide for the whole overall relationship, typically you will use each of these C's in a particular mentoring conversation. So let's move on. If you just digest that sort of flow of conversation for a while, think about how similar or different that might be to a normal business conversation that you'd have. Take a moment and just make a few notes about what you're noticing. So let's dive in. We start with contracting. And this is a reminder that mentoring is a professional relationship. And it is the contract which will help you define the territory in which you'll work. You may think you're clear about what's required of you, but actually that's a conversation with you and your mentee, making sure that you both have the same understanding, that you understand what the boundaries might be between mentoring, between coaching and counselling, and being clear about what you'll do if you're beginning to realise that perhaps you aren't the best person to help them in that moment. Contracting is also an opportunity to consider together how you can ensure that your relationship doesn't step on the toes of other people. For example, when is the conversation that you're having genuinely in the mentoring territory? Or when would it be better for the line manager to have that conversation? Or perhaps even a HR advisor? Finally, given you're both working in the same organisation, you'll need to be candid about how you will truly manage confidentiality. It can be an easy word to use, but not really observe. So talk through the details of what confidentiality will look like in your particular circumstances in your organisation. Always remember, never promise what you couldn't or shouldn't keep. At a more practical level, the contracting stage is also a time to talk about the sort of practicalities, the logistics. For example, how often do you want to meet? How long will the session be? Where will you meet? And not forgetting, who's going to buy the coffee? So as you're moving through this contracting phase, here are some example questions that could help focus you and your mentee to have a really productive working relationship. So of course you'll want to focus on what you want to work on in the mentoring relationship. What will the focus of our relationship be? But the second question is a really interesting one. How will you know as the mentor when it's best to offer your experience and when it's best for you to let the mentee work it out for themselves? That, in fact, could be the topic for a whole conversation. And it may be that over time you'll come back to that question and just work out whether or not truly offering your know-how is the right thing to do in this particular moment. Other questions, as you'll remember from how I described contracting, could be around, well, what will we do if I think you should be talking to your line manager and not me? The last few there are really much more logistical. How often will we meet? For how long and where? And of course, it's the kind of question that you should check every time you meet, because it may be that something's overrun or that something has been moved forward. So checking through how much time you actually have on the day is useful. And make sure that you use whatever time you have got well. The mentoring relationship is an opportunity to get to know each other really well. And so at the start, even though there'll be support from the training and there's internal comms about this, just have a quick conversation if there's anything else that would be helpful to share before you actually dive in and get started on the mentoring. When we meet on the workshop, you'll hear that I find contracting a really important part of the relationship, and we'll do quite a bit more about that when we meet. Stage 2 is called challenges. Now, even though the mentee has selected you to learn from your experience, we must never lose sight of the fact that the agenda for the mentoring is with the mentee. So be careful not to assume you know what they want to talk about, and start each session by checking what they want to focus on today. I particularly like the use of the term challenges for this stage of the model, because it suggests that the mentee is expected to bring something quite gritty, something that they really do need additional input or perspective on. Of course, the mentoring relationship is likely to be a supportive one, but it is so much more than a cozy chat. So when a mentee comes to a session and is uncertain what to bring, then I've got some questions which might help provide a good catalyst for the discussion. And if you're working on a challenge that is very much related to the here and now, a today challenge, then take the time to consider how it might fit with their overall developmental objective, so that any learning from the session can be integrated into the bigger picture and their bigger career plan. So here are some of the questions that might be useful for helping them determine their challenges. Questions like, what's on your mind right now? Or what's keeping you awake at night? Or if that's not generating much, check in with how their energy is. Interestingly, although the C is for challenges, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to work on problems. It could be useful to think about what's going particularly well for them. If you can unpick that, then they can really start to embrace and affirm some of their strengths. And actually that might provide a good springboard for thinking about how they could utilize those strengths elsewhere in their role or their organization. Or it may be that talking about what's going well will help them feel safe, and they might then open up about things that aren't going quite so well. You'll notice that the last question on here is in green, and that's going to be a little code throughout this recording. And that's because the green questions are where the mentor is likely to bring some of their information that they know. So for example, if your organization is going through quite a significant change and your mentee is not mentioning it, then it would be appropriate to bring that in and ask them what their thinking was on that. Otherwise, they might be in a little bit of denial and sort of not considering how it might be helpful to think about that change with your input and support. Let's move on to stage 3, and this is all about choices. This can be a particularly tricky stage to work through because knowing the organisation, you are well placed to offer your experience and advice about what options are likely to work the best. However, this is what I mentioned at the start, in that this isn't actually the invitation to share your experience. That will come in stage 5. At this point, I'd encourage you to encourage your mentee to explore their fullest thinking. Encourage them to scenario plan about their perceived challenge so that they can flush out many options. Perhaps, for example, they've faced similar challenges in the past or seen other people face them, and that would allow them to flush out some transferable learning and apply that to their current challenge. So here are some questions that might be useful to work with. Ask them, what options do you see? What do you know has worked in the past? Or what are their non-negotiables? These are the kind of things that people are quite clear that that needs to be part of the solution, even if they don't know how that will actually flush out and work in totality. What would you like to avoid is another interesting question, because this helps them say what might be thought to be unsayable, and it can free them up to work on other things. If they're holding on to something that they are avoiding, then actually that soaks up energy and reduces their creativity to think about alternatives. Allowing them to say it just gets it out there. It names the elephant in the room. Again, we have an item in green, and this is because you might want to offer some feedback. As you see them working through their choices, they might have some blind spots, and it might be appropriate just to play back what you're noticing they're including and what they're excluding. The next stage of the model is consequences. And to paraphrase Newton, I think, for every action, there is a reaction. So when they're evaluating which choices are most appropriate, it's always helpful to think about what the ripple effect could be. Very often people will consider, well, what will happen if I do X, Y, or Z? But we very rarely ask the inverse question. So what won't happen if you do X, Y, and Z? That can really generate some new and interesting insights. I think it's a common truth that pretty much all organizations have some kind of political undercurrent. And often as people grow into their careers, there is a naivety which accompanies them early on. The role of a mentor can be really important in helping them understand that logic doesn't always win, and that we sometimes have to think about the different stakeholders. We don't work in splendid isolation, so we need to think about what the kind of impact is of our choices. If we overlook this, then often short-term success can be just that, short-term, and political undercurrents can sometimes catch us out. Always bear in mind that your advice might not always be welcome just yet. That comes at the next stage. But of course, you are occupying a kind of due diligence role. So whilst it might be helpful for them to trip up on some minor things, if you can see them walking into a huge bear trap and they're going to take a career limiting route, then clearly that would be an opportunity for you to ask permission to play back your own interpretation of what might be happening. So what about the questions that you might use in consequences? What do you imagine will happen next? Or who else will this impact upon? What reactions do you predict? That's useful because sometimes people can get very caught up in their own thinking and forget that other people don't think like they think. Flushing that out will help them think about, okay, so what might be similar and what might be different? I quite like the question, what might lie beyond the limit of your own experience? that kind of invites people to think and recognize that they're not necessarily going to have the fullest information available to them. And beware, this is also an invitation for you to offer your experience. It could be that they identify that there are other stakeholders that they could learn from. The last bullet point there again is in green, because it might be appropriate for you to share some of your experience at this stage, especially if you feel they're going down a dead alley and that it wouldn't be fruitful. Finally, in creative solutions, this is where you get an opportunity to put your two penneth in. The stage of creative solutions is very similar to brainstorming, so pitch in and engage in the discussion. And remember, nothing is too radical to be offered here. The whole intention is to think outside the box. So I've got some questions later on which will help you do that. What's interesting is after having flushed out a range of choices and consequences, sometimes it's possible to create a patchwork of different ideas and put them into a complete whole. Offering your experience here can be useful, as the mentee is now in a position to compare your input to the things that they've unpicked and thought about themselves. Now, just as a word of caution, whilst it is a useful idea to offer your experience in this stage, be mindful if the mentee seems to be swallowing it whole, as I would say, really latching onto your examples without thinking about how they would use that themselves. Should that happen, just pause and remind them that no two situations are ever exactly the same, and help them think about how they could implement a particular way of working in a way that would truly suit their own personal style and the nuances of their particular situation. So what are the questions? Some really nice open questions. So what if? Or let's explore. I quite like the if it were completely up to you suggestion, because very often we have people working that are people pleasers, so they take other people's perspectives too strongly to mind, and asking if it were completely up to you really puts them in a position of empowerment, and it's playful because of course it isn't completely up to them most of the time, but just to play with that for a while will open up their thinking. In a similar way, we are often very sensible, reasonable people that recognize that we do have budgets, we do have a limit on people available, there is only so many hours of the day, etc., etc. But those kind of boundaries sometimes restrict our thinking. So again, in a playful and creative mode, by just imagining that if none of those were restrictions, what might be possible then? The final question there again is in green, and this might be an opportunity for you to bring in the breadth and depth of your experience, because if there are some similarities with things that you've done, you might want to offer some stories of what you had done and why. Always remembering, of course, that your mentee's situation will be subtly different to the one that you're talking about. And finally, we get to conclusions. And this is where you start to help the mentee find meaning from the discussion so far. You'll probably narrow things down to a practical level so that they take action. You may find that having started exploring one challenge, you've ended up in quite a different place. Don't worry, this is quite normal. And when that happens, consider then how you'll retrofit the discussion that you've actually had into the overarching objective that you either started with or that is the developmental purpose of the mentoring. Now, typically, you'd expect the mentee to leave the session with a number of actions or ideas to progress upon before the next session. Remember always, though, that the action is not really the sign of a job done. Actions have a habit of being forgotten when people leave the mentoring session because life happens. They go back to their desk and the day job takes over. So when you've identified an action, don't stop there. Allow a little bit more time towards the end of the session to stress test the action plan. For example, what kind of resources do they actually need to make that happen? what could possibly go wrong, and therefore what the contingency plans might be. Also think about how does this fit with their other activities and priorities. So here are some example questions that you might want to use for conclusions. So what are your takeaways from our discussion? Always useful, because probably you've had a far-ranging discussion, but you need to boil it down into something pithy. And don't be surprised, of course, if their takeaways are different from what you imagined. Sometimes the action can be quite a big one. So think about baby steps, as they say. What will your first step be? Sometimes people have brought a challenge and they might have been quite frustrated or angry about it. So another useful question is, how do you feel about XYZ now? And that can help give better perspective, which will put the action into some kind of context. Yet again, we have something in green, because this is where you might want to bring in your own observations of how the session or the discussion has gone. Perhaps, for example, you might have imagined them to conclude something else, and there might be times when it would be appropriate for you to not correct them, but to nudge them to consider whether or not there are other ways that they could draw learning from the session. I think this can be an interesting dilemma for the mentor, because very often the mentee will take away something that wasn't quite expected by the mentor. It can be really useful just to live with it and just see where that takes them. It might not be where you imagined or where you would have them go, but it is their journey, and it will be interesting to see how that unfolds before the next session. Of course, if you really feel that the mentee has got completely the wrong end of the stick and they could be heading off to do something that would be would lack prudence in your organization, then I do feel at this stage it's appropriate to offer that perspective. They may, of course, not take that feedback and want to change anything that they were hoping to do, but at least it's about offering that sense of due diligence so that they go into whatever they've planned with their eyes wide open. So the last thing I wanted to share with you is that the workshop that we'll be working on together has been developed from a program of works accredited by the EMCC, which is the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, which have their own particular code of ethics for both mentors and for coaches. Having looked at your own code of ethics, I don't believe there's anything particularly different between how you would normally work as a professional in Wandsworth and Richmond Borough Councils. It's just a reminder that there are some, we could be working in sensitive territories, and therefore we need to work carefully and sensitively with the mentees, given it's another internal relationship outside of the line management relationship, I mean. So if you've got a real interest, do have a look at this online, but otherwise perhaps just remind yourself of your own code of conduct and just think about how that might apply to your mentoring relationships. So I shall just leave you with the thought for the day, and this is with the code of conduct in mind. This says, the worst thing about crossing a line is when you don't know you already have. So, thank you for your time and attention. I'm really looking forward to working with you soon. If you've got any questions in the short term, please do have a chat to Sarah Goodwin. I shall see you soon. Many thanks.